As part of World Patient Safety Day, I'm proud to share with you a session from our annual scientific meeting held in June this year, focusing on patient safety. The OAA was formed at a time when rates of maternal, fetal and neonatal mortality and morbidity were unrecognisable from that today. Over the last 50 years, we have contributed towards the advances in maternal safety for mother and baby by improving standards and by education. Our strength is that we have a membership and leadership of practicing, experienced obstetric anaesthetists who are well placed to identify safety issues and respond intelligently using the best evidence and disseminate best practice to our members. The last few years have presented our profession with huge challenges, including a population with significant comorbidities, drug shortages, and lately a global pandemic. The OAA works hard to represent obstetric anaesthesia nationally and internationally as we strive to promote safety in maternity units across the world. But patient safety is not an annual event, nor is it a regular meeting. It is a way of practice that continually questions the status quo, responds openly and honestly to incidents, and disseminates lessons to the patient, others affected, and the wider professional community. Our work will never be done, even after we have overcome the current significant challenges. Rather like an Olympic team, we will be improving our performance with marginal gains until a time when no woman, fetus or neonate is harmed by our interventions, and those with challenging pathologies are given the best chance of a successful outcome. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce Professor Mary Dixon-Woods, Director of the FIS Institute, who is talking about safety in obstetric anaesthesia. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to this session on safety in obstetric anaesthesia, which I'm delighted to be chairing this morning. So the format of this morning is going to be, first of all, a presentation from Professor Mary Dixon-Woods on safety in obstetric anaesthesia, based mostly on her recent paper, The 7 Features of Safe Maternity Units, which I'm delighted to have had a small part in. After that, we will have a panel discussion and I'll introduce our 2 other speakers at the beginning of that discussion. So Professor Dixon-Woods is the Director of the FIS Institute and is the Health Foundation Professor of Healthcare Improvement Studies in the Department of Public Health and Primary Care at the University of Cambridge. She's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Academy of Medical Sciences and is an Honorary Fellow of the RCP and the RCGP. She leads a programme of research focused on healthcare improvement, healthcare ethics and methodological innovation in healthcare. And I'm delighted to hand over now to Mary to tell us about safety in obstetric anaesthesia.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really thrilled to be talking with you this morning. As Fiona says, I'm going to talk you through some findings from some recent work we've been doing, essentially to try to identify the features of safe maternity units. Just checking you can see my slides, and I think you can. And really our point here, or the starting point, is that we can learn an awful lot from things that have gone wrong in the NHS or in health systems generally. The problem is that doesn't always translate terribly readily into improvement. And we have got in some ways into a bad habit of what is sometimes called admiring the problems, which is to say that we repeatedly learn the same thing. Often the discoveries are very similar across these different disasters, but I'm not sure my slides are in fact moving along. So we have got into something of a habit of admiring the problems, which is to say we learn the same things every time, but it doesn't always necessarily translate terribly effectively into action. So we need a near practice approach to improvement that's based on really sound evidence. And that is where my institute comes into things. And we've spent a lot of time in recent years focusing on quality improvement. And that has a role. By quality improvement, I mean a specific set of techniques, but it's perhaps not got us quite as far as we would like. And so some of what I'm going to offer this morning is something of a critique of that approach, but also I'm going to emphasize that some of what's needed is a really strong emphasis on what good looks like as the first important step in improving quality. A really important point to make straight away is that staffing and infrastructure really do matter. The kind of founding guru of quality improvement identified, as many people will have learned, that there are three features important to quality: structures, processes, and outcomes. Outcomes depend on structures and processes. With improvement, we do sometimes focus too much on processes and not enough on structures, or those debates get a little bit conflated. People can think that the only thing you need to do is increase staffing and ignore or neglect sufficiently the systems and cultures that might sit behind that, or alternatively, the focus is too much on processes and culture and behaviour and not enough on structure. So I think we have to bring those two elements together. It's quite clear from the literature that not all of the variability you see in quality and safety can be explained by variability in structure. So some of what can be done is improve quality and safety by focusing on systems, on processes, and on behaviours. And this is where it's really important to look at what is going well as opposed to always focusing on what isn't. In the same way as if you want to learn how to run really fast, you don't try to learn from what I do because I'm extremely slow. You learn from people who are really good. So there's now an increasingly important literature, some of it actually developed mostly outside of healthcare, on how we learn from what's going right in everyday work. And this is a really interesting and important literature. But one of the things that I think hasn't been sufficiently clear from this is the specifics of what a vision would look like for a maternity unit. And that's really the work that I'm going to talk you through this morning. So this work was based on initially on a study of one very safe maternity unit. This was a unit that had demonstrated improvement over time, had reduced its rate of clinical negligence claims, and had very low rates of adverse outcomes. And we described this in a paper called How to Be a Very Safe Maternity Unit. Huge amount of interest in this, but clearly limited by just being one maternity unit. So we then took it further, and what we were trying to do was deepen understanding of the features of safety. And we did this by studying 5 other units, not necessarily all of them chosen to be particularly high performing, but our hypothesis was that in most units, you will find something that they're doing really well. So we were trying to understand what it is that makes those features particularly valuable to learn about. We also did a review of the literature, and we conducted a very extensive consultation with clinicians, improvement experts, managers, women themselves, policymakers, Royal Colleges, and people leading improvement initiatives. That was extremely valuable. We then held a workshop, and we held a further focus group to try to make sure that the outputs were accessible and meaningful and in plain language. So the result was this paper, which is free to download, 7 features of safety in maternity units. And I'm just going to briefly talk you through what this looks like. If you look at the paper, there are 7 features, and then what we've given is a description and an example of each one. I'm not going to try and describe every single element or example, but what I will do is just give you a flavour really of the kinds of things that we're talking about. One of the most prominent things that you see in safe maternity units, or as a feature of safety, is a commitment to safety and improvement at all levels with everyone involved. And what that looks like includes all of these examples, but one of the things that you see very vividly is that staff are skilled in noticing hazards, and they seek to address them in real time. And when appropriate, they report hazards so the whole unit can learn. And you see that noticing very prominent. And when you talk to people in those units, they will say things like, we're constantly looking to make it safer. There's always room for improvement. So no sense of complacency, no sense that it's all okay. And I think George Michael probably put it very well when he said, if you're going to do it right. So the sense that if there's something that's not quite perfect, then this is the time to notice it and do it really well. A second feature that you see is, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough, that technical competence is a very, very powerful feature of safe maternity units. And that will be supported by formal training and, very importantly, also by informal learning. Very critically, the training is multidisciplinary, and it will include structured teaching, skills, drills, and simulations. It's absolutely vital that it is multidisciplinary, because if it's not multidisciplinary, it's not going to produce safety. And when you see less good training, it's siloed, and it doesn't train the whole team. Many other features that you see of high quality technical competence. You see constant monitoring, people ready to intervene, sharing of knowledge in coffee rooms, and so on. I can't emphasize enough the importance of coffee rooms. So that kind of highly structured multidisciplinary training will often take the form of simulation, and we're seeing a really great literature beginning to emerge on this, but it really, really is vital to improvement. That ethos of learning then is reinforced through what's called in the medical education literature the hidden curriculum. So there's a constant value being placed on training. You often see a storytelling tradition, so people are swapping stories of things that they managed well, things that didn't go so well, and offering learning from it all the time. You also see people invoking the evidence base, and very importantly, training and working are not seen as distinct activities. It's a constant learning environment. A third feature then of safety is teamwork, cooperation, and positive working relationships. These are words that sometimes sound a bit fluffy, but they're actually very hardcore, and they really take an awful lot of work. I often say the soft stuff is the hard stuff. What that looks like, for example, includes people looking after each other, having good relationships, and very, very critically, if there are disruptive or bullying behaviours, they are recognised and managed effectively. They are not tolerated. If anyone wants to read a little bit further in this, Amy Edmondson's work on the Fearless Organisation and her exposition of psychological safety is absolutely excellent. And she's very, very clear that, that there is no place for shouting at people, there is no place for bullying and harassment, but there is a very powerful place for intervening in a positive way to sanction unacceptable behaviours. So this is linked to a feature of safety of constant reinforcing of safe, ethical and respectful behaviours towards other staff, very respectful behaviours towards women and families. This just is not negotiable. So what you will see as a feature of safety is that the expected standards of practice and behaviour are reinforced by everyone in the unit, all professions, all individuals, from the most junior to the most senior, and that will include staff of every type and every grade. And this is absolutely critical. And again, when you talk to people, you will see that they have cohesive and collective goals. They know what they're trying to do. They're working together towards the same aim, which is providing excellent care for women and families. You will see very strong role modelling, people being around, visible, talking about sharing their experiences, knowing how to behave, knowing what's acceptable, what's not, and again that willingness to intervene if unacceptable behaviour is identified. A very, very key feature of safety on maternity units is having what we call problem sensing systems that are used as the basis of action. And I'll be very keen to hear from our fellow panelists this morning on this, because some people have done some really excellent work on this. That will mean in practice using lots and lots of methods, which will include both hard data and what we call soft intelligence to sense and anticipate problems, identify opportunities for improvement, listen to staff and families' voices, and using clinical simulation actually as a means of diagnosis as well as training. And those multiple forms of intelligence are used to identify good practices and celebrate them where appropriate. So that is actually, again, one of those things that sounds a little bit as if it could be a little bit fluffy, but it requires a lot of psychological strength, and it requires the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and perhaps not like too much what you see in response, and being prepared to take action and to fix things. So again, it's linked to this constant learning ethos. So what you will see again is that people will be saying things like, this care isn't as good as we would like it to be. What can we do to improve it? The ability to use hard data is really critical. And that means that people are actually able to enter the data to a high quality and then use it as a basis of improvement. Very critically as well, hard data is critical, but you also have to recognize that in every healthcare system we have studied, there's an issue of fugitive knowledge, that what is left unmeasured may matter at least as much as what's revealed. And one of the tasks is finding ways to access that soft intelligence. So that will typically involve listening to people really, really hard, listening to staff, listening to women, and being able to accept what you're learning and make improvements on the basis of it. A further feature is effective coordination and the ability to mobilize quickly. And this takes a huge amount of work, continuous effort to make sure that coordination is critical, and that you can anticipate and manage challenges as they arise. It's easy to think about pushing everything to the front line, but those structured handovers, safety huddles, ward rounds, board rounds, having a helicopter level understanding of the state of the unit as a whole in real time is absolutely critical. And the importance of doing regular anticipation, so the intelligence about the state of the unit is up to date, absolutely key. This is linked to the quality improvement piece, but having systems and processes that are designed for safety and regularly reviewed and optimized it underlies every single safe unit that we have ever studied. What you will see there is people constantly reviewing and seeking to optimize working processes, and that might be theatre scheduling, it could be tools, but it's a constant effort to make that improvement all the time. Again, looking in the literature, looking to see what is working, and then making sure that's reliably adapted in practice. I think one of the things that we've had with quality improvement has been either a tendency to go for top down, so people being told what to do from on high, or too much local innovation is probably the wrong word, but too much local effort that then doesn't scale and spread. And one of the challenges I'm going to put to us today is that scale and spread, that model of small local improvements has an ongoing role, but I think it's got to be increasingly supplemented with different roles. I think there's an emerging role for designing improvements at scale, and then the task is customizing locally and being able to mobilize different forms of skill, expertise, and ingenuity to design those solutions. I'm just very briefly going to share an example of what we've been doing on that. My institute has developed a platform called Discovery, and its strapline is coming together with answers. And the idea here is that we do work with people to try to bring together people so they can design, they can co-design, co-produce solutions. We've just published this paper, again, free to download, where we've described the methodology behind specifying process improvements collaboratively. And I'll illustrate this using a project we did in response to COVID. And here the challenge was that as the pandemic hit, there was a need to adapt established clinical processes to handle COVID scenarios. So everybody knows how to handle a postpartum hemorrhage. But the challenge was, how do you adapt that process effectively to deal with a woman who might be COVID? We invited maternity unit staff, infection control experts, and human factors specialists onto Discovery. And their first ask was that they watched a very short video, which we had filmed in in fact, just as the pandemic started, illustrating one way of handling it. And we asked people to make suggestions for how they would improve the processes that they saw in the video. So it was just 4 minutes. And they watched the video and then free text made their suggestions. They made hundreds of them. And we were able to boil those down and then run a Delphi exercise so people could vote on the ones that they wanted implemented. There were 22 available. And people got to rate the ones that they felt should be implemented in terms of how strongly. So one example, for example, was on preparation and team roles. We were able to achieve consensus on a large number, but in the final task, we showed them the ones where there still wasn't consensus, showed them what they had voted for and what others had voted for according to role. And we were able to achieve 16 recommendations, which we then used as a basis of a new video. So the new video illustrates the improved practice. And this has been enormously popular, viewed 16,000 times on YouTube. Martin Bromley, who many of you will know is a patient safety advocate, described it as a gold standard. NHS Resolution have it on their website, and it's generally recognised as an example of good practice. If anyone on this call would like to join in a discovery project, we're just about to launch a big initiative to reduce avoidable injury to babies in collaboration with RCOG and RCM. And if you want to register your interest, you can sign up on Discovery. I can put that website into the chat in a minute. But again, this is going to be co-designing, co-producing better solutions where we want to bring everyone's expertise together. So to conclude, the 7 features of safety in maternity units are a commitment to safety and improvement at all levels, technical competence, teamwork, cooperation, and positive working relationships, constant reinforcing of safe, ethical, and respectful behaviours, multiple problem-sensing systems and processes designed for safety, and effective coordination and ability to mobilise quickly. Thank you very much indeed. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was excellent talk. Thank you, and I'm glad that the clicker eventually worked, because that was that was looking a bit dodgy at one point. Right, so we're going to bring in our other 2 panelists now. So hopefully we'll have a very interesting discussion. I'm sure we will. So our panel consists of Mary and also Professor Marion Knight, who I'm sure many of you will know. Marion is a Professor of Maternal and Child Population Health at the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit and at the University of Oxford. She's a public health physician and an applied health researcher whose research focuses on the care and prevention of severe complications of pregnancy and early life. And she established the UK Obstetric Surveillance System in 2005 to conduct national studies of severe morbidities in pregnancy, and she also leads the Embrace UK confidential inquiries. Alongside her and Mary, we have Miss Susanna Stanford, who some of you will have seen yesterday. She's a lay representative on the OAA Executive Committee, but most of you will know Susanna from her attendance at the OAA ASM in 2015, where I have to say I was present and very moved by her, her presentation about having experienced a block that failed during a cesarean section. And Susanna is now campaigning for guidance on the management of testing for neuraxial blocks, and management of block failure. She's an ambassador for the Clinical Human Factors Group, an honorary member of Baby Lifeline's Family Voices panel, and the patient representative for the OAA. And she also has a day job, I believe, on top of all that. So without further ado, I'm going to move to our first question, which actually is an excellent first question because it's quite sort of overarching. And I'm going to pose this to Mary first of all. And the question is, thank you for a really inspiring talk. What would you suggest as the first steps to try and implement these 7 values?
Well, that is a great question. I identified a few times during the talk that business of confronting yourself, looking in the mirror, is key. I think there is a need to engage in self-reflection, to do the analysis, to look at the 7 features and have that conversation with the team about the extent to which that looks like reality in that unit. We've actually had feedback from several units who've already done this, and they found it was very, very valuable, that by looking at, for example, are we really listening to women? Are we really listening to, we really looking at the data? Do we understand how to interpret it? Are we using it as a basis of action? They have found that very, very useful as a way of essentially holding up the mirror and then beginning to figure out where they would go next. I think there are challenges in different units. Some units are better placed to do this. Some are more willing. Some are more able. The whole mundane issue of actually getting everybody in a room is increasingly challenging, not just because of COVID restrictions, but because of the problems of releasing people to do this kind of work. So I'm keen to explore facilitated ways that this could happen. And I think there is an ongoing problem, which again, we may come back to, and I'd love to explore this with people on this fantastic panel. There is an ongoing problem with the units that really are, to use that euphemistic phrase, struggling to improve. And they do seem to have a rather distinctive profile from many other units, that 10, maybe 15% of units that really are struggling.
Thank you. Marion, did you have anything to add on this?
So I guess I wanted to pick up, and it links a bit with Mary's last comment on thinking about role models and thinking about actually cross-unit working, because that is how we can begin to spread some of these examples of good working across units. And I think, obviously, learning from adverse events is one of my particular focuses, and I think the importance of that external perspective adds to that, and having that voice and that blame-free culture. So bringing that different culture from that external perspective, I think is going to be very important to help implement these kind of messages, because when we're in our own bubbles, we don't know what we don't know. What we think is the norm is not necessarily the norm, and that's why having that external perspective is really important. And similarly, I think that's where, as anaesthetists, you can be that voice in a bubble which might be very focused on particularly within the labour ward, within the maternity unit. When you have a much wider perspective, for me, it's really important that we think about maternity safety beyond just the maternity unit, and that's why it's really important to think about anaesthetic assessments long before labour, to make sure we're thinking about what might go wrong and preparing in advance and having that plan.
Yes, and I think we'll come back to that point of what the anaesthetist can do and what the place of the anaesthetist should be. But Susanna, I just wanted to ask you, I'm sure you would be supportive of the concept of an external view and support across units. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a consistent theme, isn't it? And even in the Sheffield CQC report that's just come out this week, it's almost like people involved just didn't realise that they were sliding away from what was expected. There's no intent for it to happen, but it's just that they just had drifted from what was expected. Everybody was working well together. They just had lost a national perspective. I actually think that this is where things like the OEA Delphi project, which we did a few years ago with Marion masterminding it, that hasn't yet rolled out, but the intention I know is that to do it. But it's a really useful means of just giving a level of comparison, choosing half a dozen key indicators which you can compare, and you can just see. And one of the beauties of it is being able to argue with your management for things that you might not have, to be able to say, we are below a national standard on this, everyone else has it, and to be able to push that. It's really, really valuable. So I hope that we'll be able to get that going.
Thanks. Yeah. There's a question that's come up from the audience, which I'm not sure any of us are going to be able to answer, but I'm going to pose it to you anyway, because it's a really important question. It's about staff shortages, and staff shortages are a huge and persistent problem on a lot of labour wards, and sometimes seem like the biggest hurdle to safer labour wards. And I would add to that also staff turnover. Have you got any advice on how to get past this? So, Mary, I'll start with you, and I'll allow Marion and Susanna to think about that whilst you answer.
That is a very important question, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, that on the one hand, it's very easy to see the problem as a staff shortage problem, and that becomes the focus. There is definitely an issue with staff turnover in some places. It's a real red flag to those of us who study patient safety, because if you're having high levels of staff turnover, it's generally linked to dissatisfaction with working conditions, and it often means it can quite often mean that there's an issue with adverse culture, bullying, and so on. The second issue actually is in some ways the opposite, but it can also be an indication of trouble, which is a stagnant, very low turnover. So it actually goes back to what Susanna says, that it can become a very internally focused unit. So there's no getting around the fact that staff shortages and understaffing are crucially linked to safety. I haven't seen the research in maternity care, but there is a very, very good literature in nursing that essentially shows a link between mortality and nurse patient staffing ratios. So one of the things that might be good is to produce some evidence about that link. That would be very valuable, I think, in terms of advocacy. So people like me who study culture, behaviour, systems can't do anything about structural problems like staff shortages, but I think the advocacy has got to be there, and it's somewhere where I would really like to see an evidence base emerge. The other side of things, I think if you focus excessively or exclusively on staffing, is that the issue of culture, systems, behaviour may get underplayed. So I think my plea is that we bring those two conversations together and see them as hand in hand, not one thing or the other. We're not going to solve the staff. We can't improve safety just by focusing on systems and culture, but we're not going to improve safety just by focusing on staffing as well.
Yeah, no, it is. The two are completely interlinked, aren't they? Marion, did you have any thoughts on this?
So I'm going to sound like an echo of Mary on many things. For me, we have to have the data. Again, I think it is a particularly important problem. For me, what I need, and I do have a remit to pull out these problems at a national level, is if you have an adverse event, if you have a maternal death, if you have a baby death, and staffing has had a significant impact, then please document that in your local review, in the local clinician's report that comes to Embrace. I am then able to look at nationally across all deaths, and if I can say, 30% of women who die, there were staffing problems identified, that's an incredibly powerful message. So I do appreciate how incredibly frustrating it is to local level to just feel this is something I can't do anything about. But again, I would also echo Mary, and it's very difficult, but don't feel that is the only solution. So making sure that you are reviewing adverse events openly, and identifying other factors as well as staffing, I think is going to be really important. And just picking up on what Mary said in her talk, it's sort of the culture of complacency. We can't be complacent, and we can't assume that everything is due to staffing, even though staffing is undoubtedly having an impact. So I guess the message for me is, please tell me about it if it's an issue, because I can bring together national data which will help, and then we can direct that to to the political level and to the interventions as well that Mary is designing.
Yeah, and I think that really demonstrates the benefit of a very open culture, doesn't it? Because in fact, from the point of view of safety, information is power, isn't it? And as you say, through Embrace, we have almost a direct link through to the decision makers who can influence these things. Susanna, I want to ask you a slightly different question on this point, which is, how do you think the patient's voice can come in to these sorts of questions about staffing levels and resources on the units?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? You wouldn't want to turn up as a unit about to have a baby and be told, well, we're short of staff and we're not going to be able to give you such care. I mean, that's going to be really counterproductive. I think it is broadly something that patients are aware of. Whether they can feed that back into a larger dialogue where there will actually be impact is really hard to be able to say. There aren't many people like me who go around being noisy about problems. So patients may be aware of it, but whether they can actually create momentum to help it, not really sure.
And this, I think that feeds into another question that we've been asked by the audience. So, and this goes back to identifying the sort of level that your unit is functioning at. So it says, I think there can be a tendency to think we're offering a good level of care and we're fine. Insight can be a real issue. How can we encourage benchmarking with others? And as a sort of supplementary question, can we describe the unit that's struggling? I think, Mary, that was something that you'd identified, maybe 15% of units might be described as units that are struggling. I don't know whether you'd be willing to give us any indication of the things that might suggest that.
Yeah, there is now a nice literature emerging on this, and there's a systematic review from about 2 years ago, which has Sanjay Saint as one of the authors, and it's a systematic review of organisations that have, again, struggling to improve, I think is the phrase used. And I think many people who would read that paper would recognise many of the features. Very often those units are isolated geographically, not always true, of course, but they may be. They may have had some kind of crisis that they're recovering from, etc., etc. So we do know a fair bit about what they look like. I think this question of how you move from describing them to insight and then to action is something where we don't have quite such a good evidence base. I personally, as a researcher, find it extremely discomforting and uncomfortable when we turn up to do ethnography or observations in a unit, and it becomes clear because we go into so many of them. And this isn't just in maternity; it's in many of the areas where we work, where it's obvious something is not going well, or it's far from what you would hope for, as Susanna says, as a patient. As researchers, we're there to document what we see. We're there to use it as a basis of evidence. But there is a question about how we can feed that back in constructive ways, and how we can do something with it that then doesn't get tangled up in some other regulatory process and essentially undermine the research efforts in the goal of trying to secure improvement. So these are all big questions that I don't think anyone has any straightforward answers to. They sometimes get reduced to very unhelpful rules, like if you see something wrong, you've got to intervene. That isn't helpful to us. We're not clinicians, and it's also not helpful to start suggesting that we need to activate some process. But I think there is a very important role for essentially supporting diagnosis. I think simulation has a really key role here, because if you run something through a simulation and you realise that this just isn't going well, that is the basis for learning. Victoria Brazel in Australia has been doing absolutely fantastic work on what she calls translational simulations. A lot of it developed actually in emergency care, and developing techniques for helping with debriefing and producing learning from doing those simulations, and it really can be very, very powerful. So I think there are ways we could support that learning. I think the point about comparison is very important, but I think we also have to do something that goes beyond giving that insight to also help with the improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I was interested in something you said there, that as a research group, you go into a unit and you can almost tell as soon as you get there what the sort of level of practice is from your experience. And so I think, as you said in your talk, knowing what good looks like is actually important in knowing how you're doing. So what I'm and this comes back to a lot of the questions we're getting, which are about how to benchmark practice, and I'm going to come to Susanna now to see whether you've in your work in your general sort of advocacy work and the work that you've done in safety, if you've come across any ideas or processes that can help with benchmarking.
I mean, I think actually my primary comment here isn't so much about benchmarking, but it's a mindset. Even by referring to struggling units, you're creating an other that you might not want to identify with. And it's so important to emphasize that we can't afford to dissociate from the other. You know, the fact that it's a different specialty or it's a different unit and it's a long, long way away. And it's so easy to think that that's other. And for me, the real crux is being able to always be thinking, not be thinking we're safe, but to be asking, are we safe? Not to be looking at reports and going, or not to be sort of ignoring reports because they're not us, but to be looking at an investigation report, you know, Kirkup, Ockenden, and sort of going through and going, well, what can we learn? You know, to be going into it with that intentionality. And just to take the assumption out of it, it's really, you know, people go into healthcare to do good. They don't go into healthcare to cause harm. It's really uncomfortable to consider that you might cause harm, or to anybody that's in your unit, many of whom will be friends, that, you know, you together could cause harm. That's a really uncomfortable concept. So I just think we need to get away from this sort of tendency to step away from it thinking it's going on elsewhere, it's fine. No, always learn, look at the reports. Everything that was in Kirkup is in Ockenden. We need to get this mindset that you're just going to look, what can we learn, what can we improve?
Yes, and I think that that is comes out in Mary's paper, that the safe units are the ones who are constantly reviewing and looking at what they can do better. Yeah, so there's an interesting question come through. What's the best way to confront poor behaviours, including from leaders? So Marianne, since you haven't spoken for a while, I'm going to throw that one at you, see what you think.
Thank you for that. Well, I reflect that the older I get, the more outspoken I get. I think it's really difficult, particularly if you're more junior, to be challenging. But for me, the question to ask is why. Can you explain why? Can you tell me why that was the right response? So it's asking why, rather than necessarily being directly confrontational. And I guess that, you know, that links back perfectly to what Susanna was just talking about. It's the constantly questioning ourselves. I think I disagree slightly with the "don't admire the problems" phrasing, because I think things change all the time. The problems change all the time. So being able to ask why, being able to ask what's changed, and maybe doing it in a multidisciplinary setting where you can ask other opinions, so you're not being directly confrontational to an individual. You know, that certainly makes me change my thinking, because we know that everybody's coming from a different perspective. So if that's really going to help anybody, but you know, Mary's going to.
Yeah, Mary, what would you?
Yeah, I'd love to come in here actually, and I think maybe you're right, Marion, that the phrase "we have to stop admiring the problems" isn't quite correct, but I think we have to stop only admiring the problems. And I think this sobering reality that we keep learning the same things. Ockenden is very, very evocative of Kirkup. It is the same kinds of problems that we keep seeing in these inquiries one time after the other. So the learning isn't occurring. The business of how you speak up, how we value voice, there's now a big literature on this, and my institute has done quite a lot of work in this area. So there's quite a nice evidence base now beginning to emerge. There's a very nice hierarchy of interventions from Vanderbilt University, and that starts with essentially the softest form of intervention. Sometimes people don't realize that they are behaving in ways that makes other people uncomfortable, or that is disruptive, or that might be interpreted as bullying. And you gradually move up that hierarchy of intervention. So there's a supported cup of coffee conversation. It then moves up to a more supported intervention, and so on. That does require that somebody somewhere is going to take ownership and exert leadership. And in struggling units, you sometimes find that the leadership is ineffectual, or is in fact part of the problem. So this is where the wider institutional context, the organisation has to be able to take over. We did a very important study a little while ago in a very famous university hospital in the US, which was about dealing with transgressive behaviour. And this was an example of where we as researchers did an analysis of what the problem was, and then helped the hospital to come up with an intervention. That intervention was extremely successful, but it took a lot of investment, it took a lot of will, and it took a lot of support from the hospital management to get behind it. So to Marian's point about more junior people feeling insecure or unsupported about speaking up, that is a reality, and they have to feel that the institutional support is behind them. And that also means then that there needs to be an evidence base people are drawing on. When it gets into kind of, we've again shown we've a couple of papers on making soft intelligence hard. And basically, once you start processing some of these issues through institutional processes like complaints mechanisms or HR, bizarrely, that can paradoxically make things worse rather than better. So we do need really good evidence about how we value voice, how we, as Susanna says, how we then translate that into actual change. I'm confident there is an evidence base emerging here, but it's something I would very much like to be able to test and evaluate in the maternity space. And I think actually anaesthetists have an invaluable role here because of this issue being slightly separate from the unit itself.
Thank you. There's a sort of theme coming through the questions that we're receiving. One of them is about going back to this business of knowing what one's own unit is like. Somebody's asked if there's a place for a task force that could look at maternity unit safety and how maybe that's something that the RCOA or the OAA could set up, because a collective voice is often more powerful than an individual voice. I mean, it's an interesting concept, and obviously we have the healthcare safety investigation branch who are looking at maternity safety. So I'll come to Marian on this one first to see what you think about that.
So I have to always start out by pointing out that HSIB only operates in England, and we are in the UK. So there is a maternity safety inquiry investigation ongoing with led through the Health and Social Care Committee, who are supposed to be reporting quite soon. Interestingly, I'm not sure whether they have an anaesthetist advising. I know they have 2 obstetricians and 2 midwives, but I'm not sure whether they have an anaesthetist advising externally on the report from that committee. I think it's really important. I just want to. There's a women's health strategy out for consultation. I think responses are due imminently, but the more people that are saying these things at a national level, the more they will be listened to. So I was just going to urge people, if you have any opinions, send them into that inquiry, because the more our voices are represented, the more they're likely to be heard. I guess the one thing that we hadn't picked up from earlier questions, and it won't surprise you as an epidemiologist and health service researcher, data are going to be important. And I think if we can find a way, as Susanna pointed out very early on, to start getting those key indicators of obstetric anaesthetic safety, I think that's going to be important. We are doing some more work to try and expand to look at maternal morbidity on a national level rather than just mortality, which will help a little bit more with more targeted local data to be able to compare. But we need both, and it's really important that we have both numbers and women and health professional voices, and that's where Mary and I's work is so complementary in many ways, because Mary's got those voices, Susanna being a very key voice, obviously herself, and then I can provide the numbers, and both together will really help us, and indeed sort of thinking about the maternity safety in terms of a task force at a national level.
Yeah, thank you. Interestingly, there's a question, I'm presuming from a trainee. It says, as trainees, we're all well placed to compare practice in different units we rotate between. How can we, on short 3 to 4 month rotations, become more empowered to suggest improvements or changes in departments? And I think, I will ask you to comment on that, but I think probably what Marion was saying about contributing to national consultations is going to be important there, because obviously these people do have a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. But Susanna, did you want to comment on that one?
No, it's just simply to say, exactly. Trainees are often the best people because they are going around and they are working in different units and they're seeing it. I mean, we actually, consultants, my message to consultants listening, start asking your trainees. Why not? Come on.
And that comes back to Mary's paper, and having a unit where everyone respects each other and listens to each other's voice, and the trainees can be heard, I think. Yeah. Susanna, this one's for you again, actually. Oh, sorry, Mary, did you want to come in there?
Oh, just very briefly, I think trainees are an invaluable source of soft intelligence. And I think we could do a lot more to systematise how we're collecting information from them, and using that in a very powerful way to do some of this self-diagnostics, and also to support improvement, because as Susanna says, they're uniquely well placed to see what's good and what isn't.
And do you have any sort of concrete suggestions about how to do that?
Yes, some of the ways we're going to be building up discovery will be enabling people to have an opportunity to do that consensus building work, but also to gather intelligence, not necessarily about particular units, but about suggestions for improvement. So that will be an offer we'll be extending over the next year or so. Excellent.
I've just seen a message come up from Emma to say that there are anaesthetic advisors, one of whom is on the OAA executive committee, as we were talking about previously. So the anaesthesia is represented in the.
The other two are good as well. I know them both.
Excellent. Yes, Susanna, I was going to ask you this question. Do you think there's a place for challenging unconscious biases that may lead to women not being listened to?
Oh, yes. I mean, I bang on about listening to women. I'm sorry, I bang on about it. But the reality is that every single parent I have spoken to who has lost a child, often a healthy baby, inevitably, the common theme is that they were trying to express their anxiety and they felt that their concerns were being dismissed. And I can't tell you, there is nothing worse than talking to someone and hearing them blame themselves for not getting their concerns heard. Now, the reason I spoke up originally was that I appreciated that I was in a position, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm educated, I mean, all this stuff, right? I've got all the advantages. And I found it really, really hard to speak up. And I was always concerned about people who'd be more vulnerable than me, whether that's ethnic minorities or people who aren't in their first languages, people living in deprivation. Embrace shows it. The data from Embrace shows that women with these disadvantages, those groups are overrepresented in the data. And not only that, Marion, it's a constellation of biases, isn't it, your phrase? All of these people, of course, they're going to be less able to speak up. So we really, really need to work towards hearing women. And I mean, I can't say it any more clearly than that. Please listen and hear with the intent to try and help. As I said yesterday, for a woman, that to not be listened to and believed compounds their experience of trauma. But to be heard is the biggest thing that you can do for them to help mitigate their experiences of trauma.
Thank you. And I think, obviously unconscious bias is a difficult problem because by its nature it is unconscious. But I think that one of the main ways to acknowledge it is to listen to people and to have an open mind in doing so. And so, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. Nuala has sent us a message to say that the OAA have sent a submission to the Health Select Committee looking at government progress towards its target of reducing maternal mortality. So anaesthetic voices are being heard in this arena. Okay, I'm going back to a practical question now. And I'm sure this one will ring true with so many people, so many obstetric leads. With all the new reports coming out, it leads to more paperwork, which can be a bane that can sometimes compromise safety, as it occasionally leads to complacency. I'm presuming that this person means we've got the guideline, we've got the protocol, we've got the forms to fill in, so we're obviously doing okay. So anybody got any views on how to improve that? And I will go to Mary first to see what she thinks about this.
Another super question. I'm so impressed with the quality of these questions. I think actually the number of reports, the amount of guidance is itself becoming a problem. When we talk to units, they're often overwhelmed with the volume of stuff that's coming out, the number of things they're expected to action, and often without necessarily the support about how they translate the latest recommendation into action. The recommendations don't always line up, and they feel they have accountabilities to multiple different reporting mechanisms, bodies, and so on. So we've described this problem previously as priority thickets, that the density of priorities means it's very hard to cut through and create a clear vision. And the related problem is what we call the problem of many hands, which is that there's so many actors in the system, it's hard to find a single focal point that takes responsibility, and is able to coordinate. So I think this is actually another example of a structural problem that needs to be sorted out at political level and further down the system. So what is coming through to the units is actually a single voice and clarity and an acceptance that some of the focus has to be this near practice and how you do the improvement. I am worried about what Tim Draycott calls the report soup we've got at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. I see that we're coming very close to the end of our time now. So I think what I will do now is call the questions to a halt. I will thank our three speakers very much. I think this has been an excellent session. I've been incredibly impressed by the wisdom of all three of you, and I think we've learnt a lot. So thank you very much for everything you've told us this morning. And I will now hand back to Emma,